Hello everyone and welcome to episode 223 of Board Game Barrage, which I am told is not a board gaming podcast about board games, so I'll just read this script that Kellen gave me. It's a podcast about board games, how I've never been hot, and how to pretend I have friends even though I'm a loser. Wait, no, that doesn't sound right. Let's try this again. It's a podcast about board games, the latest hotness, and how to have fun with your friends even when you're losing. I am, as always, your yellow tank Mark, and with me as always is my co-host Kellen, the red tank, who clearly has been getting editing advice from my father. How you doing, Kellen?
I am good, but I am confused because you sound smart.
With us also is Neil in the orange tank, freshly repatriated for the land of penguins and biltong to the land of mustangs and the double down. Welcome back.
Hello, it's me, your favorite American, back in the country.
It's all good to be back together again because just as it says on the masthead, this is a podcast of Neelan, Mark, and Kellen. And with that in mind, we're going to talk about board games this week.
It's so good to be back in the country talking to you guys. You know, the good old Mark, Kellen, Neelan trio here as always.
Hey, Mark. It actually looks like there was a mix-up at podcasting headquarters.
Neelan, did you lock this channel like I told you to?
Hey, how did you get in here?
So, look, they mixed up the Mark B badges or something. I'm not really sure. You've got mine and I've got yours. I just left a very confused Walker in one of the other rooms, so you should really go in and check on him. No, all kidding aside, we are very
embarrassing.
We are very, very honored to welcome the one and only Mark Bigney, one half of the very excellent So Very Wrong About Games podcast. And you don't have to just take my word for it in regard to their level of excellence. They are the current holders of the Board Game Geek Golden Geek Award for Best Podcast of the Year. So it's not just my opinion. It is indisputable, objective fact.
Yes, it is the aggregate of many people's ignorant opinions. We are the award-ineligible podcast, and therefore I wanted to give the official imprimatur. Yours is the second most So Very Wrong About Games podcast on the internet, after my own, and therefore we are definitely putting in our vote that you guys should win it this year. So,
well, that's very, very, very kind of you. And
we couldn't get Walker for this. Where's the black tank when you need him?
Happy to be his understudy.
So we figured we'd invite Mark on the show, and then, like Caesar on the Ides of March, we'd stab him in the back and take the Golden Geek Award. But then we learned that's not how it works. And so if you're listening to this and would be so kind as to vote for us for the Golden Geek Award for Best Podcast, all you have to do is go to BoardGameBarrage.com/vote, which will link you to the appropriate page on Board Game Geek, where you can vote for all of your favorite games of the year. And while you're there, you can click on the Best Podcast button and maybe give us a vote, as Mark has said you should. So don't even just listen to me, listen to the superior Mark.
And just to be super explicit, like I like to be explicit, if you already voted for us, we have now made it onto the ballot, so you actually can officially vote for us again. So not only did we need your help then, but now we need your help now. How explicit am I being?
Is there also a category for thirstiest podcast? Because I think you guys are putting in a solid lock for that, too.
Hey, if there was, we'd go for that, too. So for today's topic, we are trying to be trendsetters. We're trying to win this Golden Geek Award. So we thought we would do the hottest thing, be on the cutting edge. So we are going to cover our favorite games from 2005 and earlier, and then maybe talk about a game that we have always wanted to play from way back when in the dark ages, and talk about that as well. So we are appealing to the youth in this episode.
Hey kids, remember Y2K?
Because I sure do. But before we get into that, we will be talking about the games that we've played this week. Neelan and Kellen are going to team up to talk about Sobek 2-player. I will follow up with Phantom Leader Deluxe. And finally, Mark will be talking about Ares Expedition. So, Kellen and Neelan, tell us about Sobek 2-players, a very interestingly titled game. Very clear about the player count, right in the title.
Quite specific right there in the title. I'll be honest right off the bat, I've not played the original Sobek, which I believe is about 10 years old. So if either of you have, I believe Kyle hasn't either, feel free to jump in with any of this, matches up with how that game works. But in Sobek 2-player, you have a grid of tiles. These tiles represent a bunch of different goods, which you could just think of as being of different colors, loosely. Each good has a value of between 1 and 3, or 0 and 3, I guess. At the start of the game, you have a marker, which is called the Unk marker, that determines which direction you are allowed to pick a tile relative to where that marker is. So, the first player picks one of the tiles based in either of the directions that the Unk marker is pointing, either in a horizontal line, a vertical line, or on one of the two diagonals. You pick a tile along that line, and if it is the first tile closest to the Unk marker, you just take it without any repercussions. But if you hop over any tiles, then all the tiles that you hop over go into your corruption pile, which is going to be bad for you at the end of the game. Regardless, you take that good, it goes into your sort of personal supply, and that is one of the ways you can spend your turn. The other way
Dancing and hopping is evil,
Exactly.
children. Corruption.
So, sorry, say that again. I missed half of that.
It's for the better.
No, you didn't miss anything.
So corruption bad. Bear this in mind. This is going to come up again. But the tiles you're collecting on your turn are going to go into your supply, and can alternatively on your turn you can just spend them to sort of start your collection of that type of good. Now, your score for that good at the end of the game is going to be however many of those tiles you have, multiplied by the total value of those tiles. So as dictated by like whether it's a 0, 1, 2, or 3 value of that good. So let's say I had 4 red goods and a total value of, say, 4 based on their respective values. I have 16 points in red goods at the end of the game. You do that for all of the colors of goods you have, and that's your total score. But you can only set up these displays of goods if you have at least 3 of them in your supply at any given time. So there you can kind of see there's some trade-off versus, okay, I have 4 of them right now. I can display those right now, but I won't be able to add to that group until I get another 3. So there's a little bit of, do I hold off now? Do I put them on display later? And so on. You add to that like the decision of whether it's worth picking a tile you want to get corruption, because at the end of the game, whichever player has the most corruption is going to be getting some negative points. Another little twist to this is peppered throughout the board are these character tiles. Now there's one of these characters for each of the colors of good, and they all have special abilities, and some of these abilities are really quite powerful, which could be something you could do on your turn instead of taking one of these 2 actions. Play one of your character tiles, do some sort of special ability, and that might be removing some of your corruption from your hand, taking goods from another player, that sort of thing. And that's kind of the gist of the game. You keep doing this. Every time you take a tile, you're moving the Unk marker, reorienting it based on depictions on that specific tile. So it could change from being horizontally aligned to diagonally aligned, which determines the direction for the other player to pick, and so on. It keeps moving around until neither player can take a turn. At that point, you refill the grid. And at the point in time where you can no longer refill the grid, that signals the end of the game. You tally up the corruption, get your points for your goods. And that is basically how Sobek 2-player works. Kellen, what do you think about the game?
So it's delightful, right? But it's also very chaotic. And it's interesting that it feels so chaotic even at 2-player, right? Which 2-player, again, is in the name, in case you didn't know how many players could play this game. It's Sobek 2-player. But you are sort of tasked with thinking ahead, right? Which is, I want this tile that much, but if I take that tile, then it's going to reorient, and Neelan is going to have a great tile that I know he wants because he's already collecting stuff in that set. And I don't know if I'm just bad at the game or if I'm unable to think beyond that one hop, which, remember, we don't hop in this game. But you think past that one turn, and my brain goes to mush, and I'm like, well, if he takes that, then I might take this. You know, this is not like chess. You know, in chess, I can think 7, 9 moves ahead like a grandmaster can. But in Sobek 2-player, I, for whatever reason, just am like so rudimentary in how I can analyze it. And that may be that I've only played on BGA, but then also BGA, by virtue of it doing the scorekeeping for you, sometimes I feel like, oh, I'm winning this, and then the end game comes up and I've lost by like 37 points, and I'm looking at the multiplication and going, how did that happen? But it's enjoyable, and I think that it was smart to take this system, and if you go back and look at the reviews of the original Sobek, right, it's like all too chaotic, so you pare it down to the 2 players, and it's just enough that it's fun, but you don't get lost in chaos land at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is smart based on my plays of it is that you do have these very specific focal points on the board, right? And that works for either player. Like, if I'm the player that's predominantly collected white and there's a 3-value white tile on the board, I know that's high value for me, and I know what the high-value tiles are for you, say, Kellen. So there are very specific foci that you have versus, like, playing in multiplayer, which allows you to say, like, okay, I know what to stop Kellen from being able to get 1 or 2 turns ahead and what I need to make sure I get, and vice versa. I do think you're right. Focusing it down to 2 players gives you just enough pinpoint look-ahead strategy which I can't even imagine if this was, a 3 or 4 player game. So do either of you have experience with the original?
I do not.
I haven't. I've played Jaipur, though, which was by Sébastien Pochon, and I believe he's the co-designer of the 2-player version of Sobek.
Oh, interesting. To this date, Jaipur is one of my biggest regrets for something I need to play at some point.
Speaking of other 2-player games, how does this rank for you guys in the pantheon of 2-player games?
It wouldn't be my first pick by any stretch. I've had fun with it enough to revisit it multiple times. And to be fair, a lot of that could just be the convenience of BGA. I can imagine the fiddliness of the setup would be a little bit more tedious in reality. But it is a delightfully sort of charming production in terms of its vibrancy, its colors. It does look nice. It just doesn't strike me as the sort of game I can see myself returning to in the 2-player realm versus something that has more of a card-driven system. That's always going to be my preference for 2 players, dueling card games. So I don't know, they're definitely not, even in the abstract realm, something like a Santorini or something closer to a chess. That Time You Killed Me, Mark, that is still sticking my head as a really good 2-player abstract game. This doesn't really hit that height at all.
But I think, you said Santorini, which is a terrible game, but Sobek it's more like King Domino and Jaipur than it's a twisted up from there. It's not super heavy, right?
No,
and
not
it's
at all.
bright and colorful. I am going to pick this one up actually to see if Christina and I like it for a non-brain burny fun exercise. But it's not in the realm of my favorite 2-player games. We're busting out some of our favorite battle line-esque systems that are obviously much better, but that isn't really, I think, the focal point of it.
For sure. That is Sobek 2 players.
So, over the past couple of years, because of the difficulty of getting gaming groups together due to the pandemic, and personally my moving out of state, I've begun to look into solo gaming. So far, I've mainly focused on lighter stuff in the solo world, with some exceptions, but I just got a chance to play some Meteor Fair with Phantom Leader Deluxe, designed by Dan Versen and published by Dan Versen Games. This is part of the Leader series of games, which include Thunderbolt Leader, Hornet Leader, Sherman Leader, U-Boat Leader. So most vehicle-based methods of combat are covered in this series. The reason I decided to try Phantom Leader, frankly, is that it was touted as the easiest and quickest to get into in the line of Leader games, at least based on my understanding of things. While I'm talking about the Leader series of games, I want to make a quick note that I did play the deluxe version of Phantom Leader, which frankly isn't super deluxe. I mean, it is nice, but do not expect anything blinged out. It's more that the original version, I guess, of Phantom Leader was quite cheaply produced, from my understanding. There's also, again, from my understanding, been some reworking of the rules, but don't let the deluxe fool you. It's just a relatively nice version of the game.
Is there a minimum requirement for a brand to advertise themselves as deluxe? Feels like we need some standards in advertising here.
I think you should probably get in on that, Kellen.
Oh,
Be
like
the leader of that.
Yes, it's like the grades of leather, but adding the word deluxe. So it's an advisory board that decides whether the word deluxe could be used in relation to your board game.
As an ambassador from the realm of historical wargaming, allow me to assure you that the DVG products are relatively deluxe when compared to a lot of other historical war games,
Sure.
You entitled privileged little babies, period.
Wow.
Well, now that I've been reprimanded, I'll move on. So speaking of these reworked rules, what you're doing in Phantom Leader Deluxe is generally you're managing a squadron of planes running a number of missions through a campaign. Now, I know the word campaign can be a turnoff, but I think that's mitigated by A, the fact that it's a solo game, so you don't have to worry about getting schedules of your friends all to line up, and B, the fact that each game takes, once you know what you're doing and you get going, about 30 minutes per mission in the campaign. What you do first is select the campaign, which is one of 8 that comes in the box, then a length. You can pick a short campaign, which I think is 4 missions, while the long campaign, I think, is something like 7 missions. And then you pick and arm your planes. So there's a number of different planes, and they're each differentiated by their pilot's call sign. Each pilot has, in addition to the stats and type of plane that they're piloting, their own stats specific to the pilot, which includes how quickly they act, and more importantly, how they react to stress, which is a big part of this game. So you'll pick your pilots for your squadron, and then you select specific pilots from that squadron for the specific mission, and then you arm the planes based on some number of points you have to spend and how much each plane can hold. So you have a full squadron for the entire campaign. You pick specific pilots with their planes for a mission, and then you arm the planes for that specific mission. You then go on the actual mission, which is to say you play the actual game. There you're presented with like a main target, which is surrounded by enemy fighters, an anti-aircraft ground weapon, and you'll need to navigate to the target, do your damage, and then exit the theater. Speaking of this, in the main part of the game, there is a lot of dice rolling, but I found it to be definitely mitigatable, if that's a word. You can definitely be hurt, as you can with all the games based on like dice rolling, by a string of bad rolls. But if you're willing to take some short-term losses, you usually can keep things under control. A lot of the pleasure in the game for me was the story that emerged, because mission by mission, your pilots will come home stressed, which will decrease their abilities in the air or make them unable to fly, period. And you have to manage your squadron throughout. You can also have pilots gain experience, and you can have them go from newbies to aces. So there's like different ranks of pilots depending on their experience level. So you can see them progress up the ranks through their experience. And because of these two things, because of the management of your squadron and because of the experience you see these pilots progress, you feel an attachment, at least I did, grow for them because of those 2 points. I will say that this game is definitely not for everyone at all. The setup is relatively long. So you'll either want to set it up, I think, and then run your entire game and then put it away. Or, as I did, you set it up on a side table, you come over, you play a mission or two, walk away, come back to it, play a couple more missions. I don't think this is the type of game where you want to keep setting it up, play 1 or 2 missions, and then packing it away, because it is fiddly. It's got a lot of counters, a lot of things to sort of manage. Also, there is a lot of bookkeeping, which I normally don't like, but for some reason, this sort of scratched this old role-playing game Dungeon Master button in the back of my head as I charted the experience and the stress levels of my pilot. For some reason, like having this sheet was like having a character sheet in Dungeons & Dragons. It just worked for me for some reason. And finally, the war theme obviously can definitely be a turnoff. The listeners on the show will know that I generally am into historically themed games, so it worked for me. So all these negatives aside, many of which weren't negatives for me, as I just said, I did enjoy Phantom Leader Deluxe. I think the in-game choices are interesting. The game is really tough, which I like in a solo game. And the story that comes out of it is something that I didn't really expect, these stories that emerge from a solo war game. So that is Phantom Leader Deluxe by Dan Verson and published by Dan Verson Games.
So this came out a fair bit ago, right? The deluxe version in 2013 and the original in
2011, I think.
And so these are solo wargaming. Is there some sense that like modern hobby board games are catching up on the solo train, but that's already been established, and we can go back and find, better mechanisms within wargaming? I don't play solo games at all, so I have no frame of reference, but it's just interesting to me that this is, 12 years old at this point, and you're finding it interesting in comparison to other solo games that you're playing now.
Right. So it's hard to say, because I think solo wargaming is probably a different sort of beast than solo Euro games. And also, I'm not super experienced in solo war games myself. Also, it's something to note, the fact that there are so many of these Leader series of games. So while I don't know the differences
There's a Cthulhu
between...
one. Did you know that?
I think that's coming out. Coming out soon.
Hornet Leader Cthulhu conflict.
No, it's been out for a while.
You wanted to play Vietnam instead of Cthulhu?
I wanted to save that one for you, Kellen. I'm going to send that to you for a birthday gift, and you can review it on the show. Yeah, exactly. I know how much you like Cthulhu. Anyhow, I think it's important to note the fact that there are all these versions of games, and even though I have no idea how they play versus one another, I think there are significant differences from one Leader game to another. But theoretically, you would suppose that the mechanisms have been honed over the course of all these games. And in fact, as I mentioned, the original Phantom Leader, in addition to the game being spruced up in terms of aesthetics, the rules themselves have been tweaked, and from what I understand, in good ways. So it seems like there's an evolution of the rules. So there's that ability to sort of keep current with modern gaming conventions or whatever.
I think it's actually quite telling that you identify it in terms of earlier trends in wargaming being picked up by Eurogames more broadly, because I'd actually like to quibble with one thing that Mark said. He identified flying the mission as the main part of the game. I don't think that's accurate. The main part of the game is actually managing all your personnel and all your equipment. This is a game that I would put squarely in the genre that I call fun paperwork, and that's something actually that Euro games and other more mainstream hobby games when compared to wargaming have picked up in the past few years. If you look at things like Gloomhaven, if you look at even more esoteric things like Kingdom Death Monster, the idea of managing things through fun paperwork is something that is kind of a design thread that has always been in solo wargaming to various extents, although none so prevalent as the DVG Leader series, I would say, but to varying extents in lots of different games. And that is coming more and more to the fore in lots of other hobby games experiences. And so very much the same way that a number of Euro designers picked up on the way multi-use cards were being used in card-driven war games about 20 years ago. So I do see this kind of cross-pollination between different design threads, whether they're explicitly picking up on these threads or just implicitly picking up on them.
And I would agree with you wholeheartedly that the management is, if not the bulk, at least half the game. And that was the part that, again, surprised me the most. I find that the actual like piloting the planes and doing the missions to be fun and with interesting choices, but the managing of the squadron is where this quote-unquote revelation of the game came to me.
If you want the missions to be a little bit more detailed and tactical, I would suggest Thunderbolt Apache Leader, because that's the series where instead of just having a more abstracted notion of the approach and the deployment of weapons, you actually bust out hexes and you put enemies in specific hexes and you start moving your units around as though it were a tactical hex-based miniatures game. So that, of course, increases the length and complexity in a commensurate manner. And for what it's worth, that's my preferred system. Largely, though, again, because I find close air support more interesting and I find the hardware more to my taste than the other Leader games. But that's basically the thing when it comes to historical wargaming. Pick the theater and pick the historical time period you like the most generally, and it's hard to go wrong that way.
Yep, agreed. Absolutely.
I think we're hearing the smartest influencer I've ever heard speak in real time.
Yeah, I just finished talking.
I did just want to pick up on one little thing really quick to both of you, actually. The idea of fun paperwork is something that appeals to me a lot, actually. It's something I remember talking about in the context of stuff like Gloomhaven, like Tainted Grail, working through that stuff and like recording stuff and taking the notes. It's a bit of a throwback to the games I used to like a lot when I was a kid,
100%.
like game books and that sort of thing. And I know that that's true for you as well, Mark. So I'm curious, like, is it just purely a sort of a nostalgic, like, this is reminding me of a thing I used to do? Like, because I look at Kellen, for example, and I would say that Kellen would say that is a travesty of like a game design, right? Having that minutia, those are like little bits and bobs, that fiddliness built into the design is something you would try to streamline out of a game in 2022.
Right. And so the reason I wouldn't recommend this for you, Neelan, and I'm close to recommending it for you, is just the theme, just the war thing.
I mean, there's a lot I would have to get past to like pick up a World War game regardless, but...
Right. So the reason that Gloomhaven didn't work for me was the amount of setup and teardown, and that's present in this game, but the workaround for this game is that because it's a solo game and the campaign factor of Gloomhaven, like, okay, I've got to arrange to meet with these friends every week to get the thing going and to keep the momentum. With this, the campaign is, first of all, at most 7 games. Each game is 30 minutes. I can set it up, walk away, come and play a couple games that are 30 minutes long. And so, like, the time pressure and that burden that I felt with Gloomhaven isn't here.
Sure.
I think if there was, and I'm sure there is, a version of this game that is fantasy or that is non-war like theme, that I would recommend to you absolutely. And I don't think it's just a nostalgia thing, the paperwork. I think there is something fun. I don't know if this is like a thing that you would find in more wargamers than the general populace, but there is something fun about like charting things and writing things down. I think that's just something that appeals to many gamer brains. I don't think it's this is an archaic thing that was left in and I'm just liking it because it scratches an itch. I think there's more to it than that.
Having played it both in real life and in Vassal, I do agree that there's something pleasant about the tangible elements of managing your forces. The comparison I would draw, this is a bit of a stretch, is to Kemet. When I play Kemet, I feel like I'm playing a game of shopping. When I'm playing Thunderbolt Apache Leader, I also feel like I'm playing a game of shopping. And for what it's worth, as a pacifist, I actually find the level of granularity satisfying. This isn't a game where you abstract away to, I've conquered this territory. This is a game where I have purchased a Moab and a 500-pound bomb, and I deploy it in this hex against these specific people at this specific time. And it's definitely not meltwater. This is not a satire of war, right? I'm just saying that as somebody who is simultaneously shocked and abhorred by the deployment of force, but also fascinated by military technology, which is, I think, a place a lot of pacifists find themselves in, and certainly a lot of wargamers find themselves in. That level of specificity, that level of detail, that level of grit really can't be achieved by other kinds of mechanisms.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I found that myself in this game when it comes to having like named pilots, and having stress be a part of it. I found that really important. And also you have the opportunity when you're arming the planes to arm napalm. And that's like I felt something when I had the choice of arming napalm, and I couldn't get myself to do it. And there might have been a strategic or a tactical benefit in the game, but it was just like, it felt so abhorrent to me that
My fight, and there is a fight, and we could spend a whole episode on this, but that's not the topic of this episode, is that I don't think that anyone has sufficiently proved that these shouldn't all just be video games. And in fact, like when you break it out and say that I'm playing it by myself, the components aren't that good, everything that you're describing about sort of investing in the people, the units, the things, like can be done in video games and is done in video games, just better. And your ability to sort of like math out different builds for different types of people and units and strengths, these have existed in video games for, obviously less time than in board gaming, but I don't think that anyone has sufficiently proved to me why these can't all just be video games that would be less tedious with no setup and tear down and the same level of fun or more.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think for a lot of people that a video game will be a better option than this. But for me, I know that video games like this exist. I'm not plugged in as you guys are with the video game world in general. But for some reason, I don't have a draw to playing something like this with a video game, whereas having the tactile things to move around and the cards, something about the tactility of it really appeals to me. Whereas, if you said, here's this game as a video game, I don't know, it feels a little less substantial to me for whatever reason. That's just my own thing.
In addition to the tactile element, when you digitize something like this, what you're doing is you're rendering the systems more opaque. There's a level of transparency in tabletop gaming that video games, even when they are a direct digital implementation of a cardboard analog equivalent, you're going to lose that. And the more removed you put the user from the underlying systems, you are changing the experience. Unlike you, I'm not going to argue that one version of the experience is better or worse. I'm just going to join my esteemed Mark colleague and assert that when it comes to experiences like this, I prefer it in this venue. And if you want to tell me I'm wrong to have my preferences, that's cool. You can go do that. But it is the case that for lots of people who would never touch this, they'd rather have a digital version. I'm very, very happy with the analog version.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think when they made Gloomhaven digital and I was clicking around in it, I was like, this got rid of a lot of the challenges I had with Gloomhaven. Yeah, interesting. Rendering systems
Gloomhaven's a great example. There are lots of people who only want to play it pure cardboard. There are people who want to play the purely digital version. And then there's a lot of people in the middle who want to have some level of digital assistance, but are going to keep playing with the board game version. And I think it's great that the hobby is big enough to accommodate all these different kinds of experiences.
Yeah, to be clear, I'm not disagreeing with you, just so we disagree about a lot of things, which is fun. In fact, I had a freak out moment when I found out that there are video games now that even will show you the experience that you gained in a battle, and they'll actually show you more experience than you actually gained, but they just want the numbers on the screen to flash like higher and higher, but the actual experience you gain is much lower, and it freaked me out for like months. I was like, this has got to be illegal. Like, they can't do this, and
Sure.
and in fact, it's totally fine for whatever reason.
So that, again, is Phantom Leader Deluxe by Dan Verson and published by Dan Verson Games. Mark, why don't you tell us about Ares Expedition?
So, Terraforming Mars. When Terraforming Mars first got released, a number of people, myself included, said, why would I play this when I could just play something like Race for the Galaxy? Card-driven tableau builders are certainly very, very prevalent in the hobby, and I personally didn't find anything in Terraforming Mars that elevated it, and certainly nothing that would justify taking 4 times as long to play a game with that much bloat and that much busy work and less player interaction. And along comes Terraforming Mars Ares Expedition, and I really have to do them credit, because it continues to develop on that same design thread introduced in Terraforming Mars, which is to say, how can we make something that is simultaneously intensely derivative of a brilliant game and simultaneously uniquely mediocre at the same time? And this is really a shame because Sydney Engelstein worked on this, and I've really liked her work on a lot of other Stronghold games. Usually her designs are characterized by some sense of effervescence or fun or bizarre weirdness. I'm thinking of the Dragon and Flagon, all the Space Cadets games, and ultimately Terraforming Mars Ares Expedition is yet more like Race for the Galaxy mechanistically. I will note that they don't credit Tom Lehman anywhere in the rulebook for any of the inspiration they have, which I think is a bit of a classless move. I think when you're going to be ripping off some of those fundamental design elements like almost the entirety of the role selection mechanism, you should at least give a tip of the hat. It costs you nothing, it loses you nothing, and yet it gains you a great deal of credibility. You should at least put some sort of acknowledgement in the rulebook. And honestly, it doesn't work on a lot of the same things that made Race for the Galaxy great. I see what they were trying to do. They were trying to prevent you from having to learn a new iconographic language, because that is one of the hurdles for learning Race for the Galaxy. Race for the Galaxy, I think, is one of the best card-driven tableau builders of all time. It's probably my favorite. But you do have to learn how the iconography works. Parenthetically, over the course of the past week, I have played Race for the Galaxy, and I actually taught new people Race for the Galaxy online on the excellent Board Game Arena implementation. So shout out to the people who were responsible for that. Souris du Désert and Galahar, two fine French users of Board Game Arena. And when you're learning it there, all you have to do is mouse over a card, and it will tell you exactly what the card does. And you can learn the iconography that way, which is much more organic. Terraforming Mars, Ares Expedition, on the other hand, seeks to remove that with inconsistently worded text effects that also make it almost impossible to easily parse what your tableau gets to do at a given time. Couple that with the traditional Terraforming Mars approach to deck bloat, and you have something that I find, honestly, an utter and complete step back in all ways from its vastly superior progenitor. Terraforming Mars Ares Expedition, I felt like it took roughly 2 to 3 times as long as it should have. Everything was more cumbersome than it ought to have been. You spent a lot of time just moving income trackers around just to try to get enough so you can play out the next card, which may indeed be entirely duplicative and redundant with that previous card you put out and is just the same. And, or, of course, you can't find the card to synergize with the strategy you want because the deck is so massive and so many of the cards have timing considerations, which means you can't play them during the latter half of the game anyway. And I assume this was all just in service of just having a thicker deck, which, parenthetically, incredibly minor quibble. I'm accustomed to expansion decks not being cut of the same size or having different color card backs. The cards in the game aren't the same size, making it really hard to... Come on, guys,
awful.
This is basic stuff. In the base game box, all the cards should be the same size when you all shuffle them together. Anyway, so...
How does that even happen? That's kind of incredible to me.
It's so Stronghold, I don't know what to say. It's actually evocative of the first print run of Terraforming Mars, because in the first print run, they miscut the cards such that they didn't do the corners correctly. They had to ship everybody replacement decks. At any rate, I think it's great that hobby games are entering big box stores, and indeed I found Terraforming Mars Ares Expedition in, I believe you call the big box store the Target. I think that's how it's pronounced.
Certainly Kellen does.
And it's great that it's reaching a wider audience, but honestly, I don't see why anyone would want to play Terraforming Mars Ares Expedition when Race for the Galaxy exists. I found it very, very disappointing, but at the same time, kind of to be expected. At any rate.
I won't lie, Mark. I did have this hope, because I know you're not a huge fan of Terraforming Mars, which I actually don't think any of the three of us are. I'd hoped that this was going to be like some sort of like twist, that this suddenly had fixed everything by steering closer to Race for the Galaxy. But I think you're exactly right. Like it's one of those things where it's like they take a base, which, you know, love it or hate it, we happen to hate it, and then you sort of twist it closer to something that a lot of people like a lot, and then you don't quite reach that, and now you have something that is muddled confusion of the two and not as good as what either of those sides wants.
Yes.
It definitely struck me as bizarre. Now, Mark, our Mark, God, how am I going to tell the two of you apart? Green Tank.
Good evil. Good Mark, evil Mark.
Good Mark, bad Mark. I know you happen to like Ares Expedition more than the original Terraforming Mars. And
yes,
that's true for you as well, Yellow Tank. Yeah?
I don't know. The thing that baffled me was just how long I was spending slugging through this nonsense. Again, I think partially because of deck bloat and because of its sloppy approach to the economy of things. Again, that simultaneously made me really appreciate how good Tom Lehman is at drafting a card deck and the care he takes in crafting what goes on there. If I had to choose between Terraforming Mars and Ares Expedition, I don't know which one I would prefer.
Oh, interesting.
For me, the primary reason why I prefer Ares Expedition over the original Terraforming Mars is just the length of the gameplay. Mark said that he felt like he was slogging through Ares Expedition, and I totally get that, but it's the lesser of two slogs for me. And also, I just like a Race for the Galaxy so much that just the approximation of it makes it a better game for me over the predecessor. I don't hate Terraforming Mars. I just, again, find it such a slog that when I was presented with this chance to play a quicker version of it, and we played it, I'm like, okay, well, I was never going to play Terraforming Mars again, probably, but now I'm definitely not, because if I ever wanted to, I would play this. And yet, after that first 2 plays of Ares Expedition, I've never gone back or wanted to go back to it because, as Mark said, if I want to play a Race for the Galaxy game, I'll play Race for the Galaxy.
It strikes me that it's deeply cynical, which is that you just take a game that is a lifestyle game for many people, put a colon on the end of it, and then rip off another popular game and then just sell it to the people who love the base game. It's sort of like you could take Root or Everdell or Scythe and then just release games upon games that are all just riffs on other stuff but lesser versions. Feels like something that happens in like moviedom, where they just sort of take a plot line from a different movie and then make Die Hard 6 out of it. And people go see it because it's got the Die Hard name attached to it.
I'm inclined to agree, but at least Frixelius is attached to this project. I've seen actually some rethemes or redevelopments or pseudo-sequels where the original designers aren't involved at all. And number two, some of the unfortunateness that I was experiencing in Ares Expedition was specifically reminiscent of the unfortunateness of Terraforming Mars, so there's that at least. And that is Terraforming Mars, Ares Expedition. May we never see it again.
All right. Before we move on to our main topic, what could we talk about here in the middle? What could we talk about?
I mean, we could...
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Go to BoardGameBarrage.com/vote and vote for us for best podcast. Vote for all the games you like. Vote for best artwork. Vote for all that stuff. Do all that stuff. But while you're there, there's a little button that says best podcast. Why not go in there, vote for the best podcasts? You can vote for whatever you want, but maybe you give us a first place or something. I don't know. That's what I would say. If you have any issues doing that, I know that if you have a new account with Board Game Geek, you may have difficulty. You may need Geek Gold or something. I'm not going to even go into what Geek Gold is for those who don't know or don't care. But if you have any issues, I would encourage you to go to our Discord at BoardGameBarrage.com/Discord, which is, I think, among the friendliest places on the internet for people who are into board games. There are people there, including the three hosts of the show, who are happy to steer you in the right direction, happy to give you their Geek Gold for free.
I converted all my Dogecoin into Geek Gold. I'm going to be rich.
What is that conversion rate?
It's 43 Dashins to 1 Geek Bullion.
Perfect. You must have got it at the upswing, it sounds like. Okay, so let's go into our feature topic. We're going to be talking about games from 2005 and before, and we will each go around talking about a game that we would recommend from that time period, and maybe a game that we have yet to play from that period that we are interested in playing, and maybe we'll see if one of the other hosts has played it and can give us some insight about them. So,
does it feel like there's an unfair advantage, Neelan, because we got two old people here with us?
Speak for yourself.
Excuse me?
Yeah, you don't want to get dragged into that, Neelan. All right, Whippersnapper, why don't you tell us about a game from 2005 and prior that you...
Yeah, so I do have games in my top 50 games of all time list that are from this time period, like I'm the Boss, but I wanted to highlight a different game that you hear me ramble on and on about all the time. But I did want to stick with the man that I love, Sid Saxon, and talk about a game from 1964. This is Acquire, a game I find still very relevant today, and one that I think that most modern hobbyists should seek out and attempt to play. It is played on a grid. You have chunky tiles that are randomly drawn, and you, on your turn, are playing a tile, and then you're buying up to 3 shares of a company, and those companies are defined by interconnected sets of tiles on the board, and then you're drawing back up into your hand to the hand limit. And essentially, that is all you do in the game. As you connect to tiles together, you form a company. Companies like Saxon. I love that he named a company after himself. That is a baller move. Thank you, Sid Saxon. You are a baller. I would do the same. Companies like Zeta, Hydra, America, Fusion, and you're building up those companies, and the more links that they have or the more tiles on the board that they have, the more valuable that they become. But then the secret twist is mergers. And similar to another game that we've talked about on the show before, Stevenson Rocket, you are actually making most of your money in this game off of the mergers. So you are desperately trying to jam companies into other companies and be at a certain point, right? Sometimes you want a lot of money, which would mean you want to be the loser in that merger because the losers cash out. The person with the most shares in that company gets a bonus, second most gets a bonus, and then you're converting your stock into the better company. Once a company snakes into a certain amount of tiles, I believe it's 11 or 12, they become locked, and you can no longer break up that company or cannot be combined with another company. This is fast playing, and this is just a riot of stocks. I feel like, and it's not a fair comparison, we played Bear Raid And just in terms of just the fun of buying stocks and understanding and feeling that, like Bear Raid takes twice as long as Acquire and is half as fun. And again, I like Bear Raid, so we're starting from a premise of I like this game. But Acquire just is one of the only games, mass market games, that my father will play with me, which I think I have said before on the show. Just always a fun time. Neelan and Mark, have you played Acquire?
I have. It's been a long time. I remember my last game I enjoyed, but it feels like a game that I really should be going back to. And especially with you, it's that type of interactive, I'm going to take over your business sort of thing where I think we would enjoy it.
And Mark, you have played it because I see you smiling. Do you enjoy Acquire? You play it any time recently?
I like Acquire. I think it actually suffers in comparison to Stevenson's Rocket. And so I tend to prefer that. My big beef with Acquire, brilliant game ahead of its time. If you're not involved in some of those early key mergers, your cash flow is going to be so poor, there's not really a chance to recover. And I really like what he's done with random tiles. I think a lot of the randomness works to the game's favor, but that element kind of keeps me from loving it as much as a lot of other people do.
Yep. And I think I agree with you. I think Stevenson's Rocket is on a whole nother existence of complexity. And so you can play Acquire with my father, who hates board games and laughs at me every time he sees me playing them. Though he does listen to the podcast to hear my voice. And my younger brother said, who needs to talk to Kellen when there are 222 episodes I can just listen to him of in our family group chat this week?
Maybe I should say that next time one of my family members is pestering me for my help.
There you go.
Yeah, here's a lot of episodes. Just look for the gems. I agree with you. There is a little bit of silliness in the tile draw that can impact the game negatively. I find that it's over before it matters. It's a shorter game. But yes, if I could riff on it, it would be riffed on right there to figure out some way to solve that. Yes, but that is the game I wanted to highlight. Acquire from 1964. Definitely worth seeking out, if not to just try it to see what it's got in store for you. An old game. How old would Acquire be right now? Mark, can you do the math for me?
64?
1964.
It'd be what, 60? No,
58.
it'd be 58, yeah.
26. Okay, so
We've already done it. We've done it.
Younger than you two, right?
Just barely.
Oh, the joke is that we're old. I get it. Okay.
All right. Progressing in age, Neelan.
Yeah,
Why don't you tell us
you.
about it?
It's. I think I have the most recent entry to the hobby of the four of us. So I only started playing board games in around 2012. So this was actually not a very, very hard topic, but one that was harder for me to find games that I had actually played that were Olden. And the thing is, the games that came up most frequently was a lot of Knizia games. You just have to look at a lot of my favorite Knizia games: Taj Mahal, Stevenson's Rockets, which you mentioned earlier, Tigris, Euphrates, Ra. I mean, they're all from before 2005. As I feel like a lot of the best Knizia games tend to be. But I've not picked a Knizia game, because what I have picked is another beloved set of designers, those of Splatterspell, and this is Bus. I replayed this recently, and this super elevated, in my opinion, since my very, very first play. I played this for the first time with Mark, Kellen, and Christina maybe a couple of years ago. I would say this would have been right before COVID, or close to the start of it at least. And I had such a miserable game of Bus, where I remember maybe scoring a single point. And to be fair, games of Bus are in the 10-point realm, so it's not a high-scoring game. But
That's just what we told you.
Thank you. Yeah, typical scores were 50. Neelan, you did great. So I came out of the game scoring next to nothing, and it was just miserable, because it's one of those games that the way that a lot of Splatter games work is almost like this clockwork setup. Here's your best intentions, do this and this, but then let's run the simulation and see what happens. And that never works in my favor in the case of Bus. But coming back to it recently, I played this a couple of times at Dice Tower West, and I really, really loved it. I was so even compared to other Splotter games I've played, and in fact, I'm prepared to say that this is maybe my favorite Splotter game now. That there's something so clean about the design that I just kind of love. It's the simplicity of the worker placement system A, which is kind of remarkable given that obviously it's potentially, arguably, the first worker placement game. Is that correct? Or at least in that conversation?
Yeah, I think it's in the conversation.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It's so clean. It works so beautifully. Every action feels important at the appropriate moment, and then when you get those machinations working perfectly on the perfect turn and it just unwinds in your favor, it just feels really, really wonderful. So much so that we actually played it twice back to back that day. Have a newfound appreciation of Bus. Think it's great. The new version that Capstone put out is just clean and lovely looking as well. Wonderful game. This is from 1999, the original version.
Two things. One, I love Bus as well. I've never seen the original board. I mean, I've seen it in pictures, and it's just so kooky that I've always wanted to sort of see it in person. I know that there are a lot of like inside jokes and stuff when it comes to street names and stuff. And the other thing is that it's funny, Neelan, because you had a similar sort of course with another spotter game, Great Zimbabwe. Yeah. Your first game, terrible, and then you
totally turned around on the Great Zimbabwe as well on subsequent plays. Yeah, I have not played that many Splotter games in the grand scheme of things, but I would say that my opinion of Food Chain Magnate did not change substantially. Like, I like it a lot, but I felt that strongly after the first game. But there's just something about... It is a complexity, obviously, because they are fairly heavy games, but it's a different order of complexity almost, where there's some initial twist that you have to internalize to the way the systems work that doesn't become apparent on the first play, at least not to me.
I think that maybe the most genuine compliment you can give a board game is that we played it 2 times in a row, like back to back. I can't think of a way to articulate better. Like, we wanted to do it twice right then.
Yeah.
So like that's such a like effusive praise.
So while Neelan would not pick a Knizia, I am picking a Knizia. One of the difficult parts for me when it came to picking a game pre-2005 was just I didn't want it to pick something that I think Callan has alluded to this as well, just something we haven't talked about on the show a lot. And so this is probably not one of my favorite pre-2005 game, but one that I don't think we've talked about on the show that I wanted to bring to light, and that is Dream Factory, which is a Knizia closed auction game. Listeners of the show will know that I like economic games. I like economic closed auction games like the Estates and like Container. This is another one where no money enters the system. But the thing that makes this fun, aside from the elegance of a Knizia design, is the fact that what you're doing is you are a movie studio and you're putting together films. And there's something fun about that. You know, you have to hire directors and hire stars, and they've got these titles of the films that are joke titles. The edition I have is Dream Factory, which caricatures of, well, at the time, modern Hollywood people. So there's like Steven Spielberg, and there's Eddie Fermi or something. So you have like Steven Spielberg and Eddie Murphy and stuff like that. So it sort of makes it feel a little more like a spoof on movie making. But again, the design itself is very simple, very clean, and again, for me, very fun having the closed economy where you know that if you bid a lot, in this game, when you bid on a lot of stars and directors or whatever, the money that you bid gets distributed to your opponents. So it's got that thing that you see in the Estates, for example, where you know if you're giving up money, you're benefiting your opponents. And there's that tension that is throughout that, again, is sort of broken a little bit by the fun and the silliness of the theme. That is Dream Factory from 2000.
I've always wanted to track down the original Traum Fabrique, which didn't have the silly parody titles and had original classic movies from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, but I've never had a chance to try it on a copy.
And that's only in German, right? That was only released in Germany? Yeah, right.
The claim is that there were rights issues, but I don't know.
Right.
There is a company who's picked this up, Mark, to make a horror-themed version called Nightmare Factory that is supposed to be coming out pretty soon. I remember seeing this on BGG and just went hunting for the news, so... Horror movies, Nightmare Factory, if this sounds interesting.
You were looking for Cthulhu-based games, I suppose.
That is slander, right?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to do that.
I see a retheme coming. You're not making movies, you're making teams of Pokemon.
Yeah, see?
Now
that's
what
not slander. That's he gets it. He gets me.
I will remind you, I used to be the official Pokemon Master of Canada back when I worked for Nintendo.
What?
Uh-oh.
Yes.
How have we not talked about this in our hours of discourse?
In my misspent youth, not to make it sound too dirty, I have done a great many different things for money. And at one point I worked for Nintendo of Canada, and I was their official Pokemon Master for a while.
Does that involve, like, you know, being an encyclopedia of how tall Diglett is and, you know, how much Charizard weighs?
Back when there were but a mere 151 Pokemon, yes.
What about Missing No?
Did Missing No have biographical stats at that time? I don't think so.
This is not what I was expecting when we had invited Mark on the show.
He's legit. I have to change my tune. Can we edit out the mean jokes that I've made?
All right, Mark, what game do you want to put up on the table?
First of all, I'd just like to disaggregate the notion of being old and playing older games, because one of the first things that I did when I got into the hobby was chasing down some of the back catalog of things that were published before I entered the hobby. And people talk about the cult of the new as though it's a bad thing. There's two arms to that, right? There's the trying lots of new releases, which I think is fine in and of itself. And then there's a myopia of never going back to things that were published before you joined the hobby, which I think is sometimes a bit of a shame. But again, people should enjoy what they want to enjoy. I definitely don't think that it is fair to infer that back in 64, when Acquire was released, that's when you first started playing it, Kellen. And in very much the same way, the game that I'd like to talk about was released before I was born, and that is Civilization by Francis Tresham. Now, this isn't Sid Meier's Civilization. This isn't Sid Meier's Civilization, the board game. This isn't Civilization New Dawn. This is the original Civilization, which was published 12 years before Sid Meier ever dreamed of entering the genre. And it was originally published by Francis Tresham's in-house design, but then the more prominent version was published by Avalon Hill. And the good news is, I will stress, it is currently in print. Gibson's Games, a UK publisher, has a version of Civilization in print. It's not perfect, but it is absolutely a way to play the game. And I have to say that most Civ games do indeed fall under the general Sid Meier mold. But the problem is, more and more it strikes me as like history cosplay. You know, Phalanx is fending off battleships, and your immortal god King Caesar using paratroopers to capture the Hanging Gardens of Babylon or something like that. You know, you get all these pointillistic references, but nothing else. And the thing that I adore about Civilization, the reason why it's endured, is because it gives you a genuine sense of sweep. Not about a whole bunch of random disconnected details out of context, but an actual sense of sweep and development. You start off with a single tribe, you get early urbanism, you get to decadence, to catastrophe, to decline, to renewal, all of these great things. And it does so with a relatively simple rule set. Anybody who's familiar with medium-weight Euro games can absolutely play a game of Civ. Now, it does feel its age in terms of the length. We're talking about, you know, from a shorter scenario of about 4 hours. If you're going to go the full distance with the full 7 players, you're looking at more like 7 to 8. But it is an absolutely approachable experience from a rule set. And one thing that I just want to emphasize in terms of how the game works from a rules perspective, about how much economy it gets out of its components in particular, your civilization is represented by your pool of tokens. And they represent population on the map, and in your treasury, they represent coins, but it's the same component. And that limitation is one of the brilliant juggling acts that you have to execute when playing a game of Civilization. Because as you get more and more cities, your taxation base grows. But if you run out of tokens, because you've spread yourself too far, you've spread yourself too thin, then ultimately what happens is running out of tokens indicates a tax revolt, and suddenly your cities rebel. Similarly, if you don't have enough people on the board, you're not able to feed your cities, and your cities have to get reduced. And so there's constantly this population pressure, but the pressure changes based on what level of urbanization you're in, at what stage of development you are in your civilization. And all of this happens organically, just from your pool of tokens. This doesn't happen through some sort of set of special rules or some sort of chart that you consult about what year it is and what technology level you're advancing into. It all happens organically, and it feels like the development of a people. And on top of that, there's this trading element, which a number of people focus on because you're going to be spending a lot of time trading commodities. What this ensures is that no matter what your player count is, everyone is involved in the game at all times, especially when the trading is concerned. You are never in a position that you are so frequently in a lot of troops on a map games or 4X games. Oh, they're on the other side of the board. I have nothing to do with them. I don't care what they're doing. It doesn't matter. Because both in a proactive way in terms of being able to trade commodities, also in a destructive way in order to trade calamities, everyone at the table matters to everybody else. It is such a genius level of design. Most people, it's a shame, who when they go to play Civilization assume that they should play Advanced Civilization. Now, there's a great doctrinal dispute about whether Advanced Civilization or Civilization is to be preferred. And I've had the same argument with many people over and over and over again who have played Advanced Civ but have never played Basic Civ or Original Civ or Civ Simpliciter. And you can prefer Advanced Civ over Civ. That's okay. I think you're wrong, but that's okay. But don't try to tell me that Advanced Civ is better than Civ Simpliciter if you haven't tried the original. Because just as I said, you can look at a Tom Lehman design, try to rip out some of the bits and copy it and graft it onto your own deck that isn't as good and isn't as balanced and isn't as calibrated. I would argue that a parallel process happened with Advanced Civilization because Tresham wasn't involved. This is, after all, the man that A, invented the Civilization genre, B, arguably invented the 4X genre, and C, invented the 18XX genre. So I think he's a guy whose intuitions you should be differential to, and if you have any interest in longer experience type games, but you don't necessarily want to get smacked in the face with dense rulebook right up front, I absolutely recommend Civilization unreservedly. And if the only way you can play is by playing Advanced Civilization, well, try to get new friends.
Mark, I have never been more thrilled to have someone cut me off at the knees, because this was actually going to be my pick for a game I most want to play. Down to even the joke where I was going to troll you and say when Sid Meier invented the genre in 1991.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry to step into jokes.
It's totally good. I could not be thrown off the because I could listen to you talk about Civilization for a while. I was excited to bring it up because I know how much of a fan of Civilization you are, and I think if anything, you've done nothing more than coerce me that this is a game I now have to play. I will be honest, my introduction to the genre is Sid Meier's Civilization, as a lot of people I would say my age or younger is. But that said, just from like the historicity perspective, I really feel like I owe it to myself to at some point play Tresham's original.
I am more than happy to play a game that's 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. And when I complain about the length of a game like Ares Expedition is, 75 to 90 minutes, and that's solidly 60 to 70 minutes too long. I'll happily play games that are longer, but I want them to have a sense of scope, a sense of sweep, a sense of narrative, a sense of ebb and flow. And that is something that no game I have ever played can capture as well as Civilization does. The rise, decline, the ebb and flow, the notion of certainty, the cast iron certainty that you're completely out of the game because that volcano completely came and swallowed up your major urbanization centers. With careful play and careful population management, suddenly you're the ascendant power 2 rounds later. And it is brilliantly handled, again, all with a relative simplicity of rule set. Tresham's brilliance still stands unparalleled, I think, 40 years on in terms of just the sheer contributions he's made in terms of inventing new genres. I mean, we can all agree that Knizia is a genius. He didn't invent the auction game, he perfected it. He didn't invent the tile-laying genre, he perfected it. Tresham, on the other hand, came and completely changed all gaming in the West as we understand it.
I did have a couple of quick questions if you'll know. You've answered one of them already about Advanced Civ versus Original Civ. I am curious to know, have you played like any of the more modern re-implementation stuff like Western Legends?
I have. So I've played Mega Civ. Western Empires and Eastern Empires are Mega Civ chopped up.
Okay.
It's a bizarre kind of design thread, actually, because Mega Civ is clearly an evolution of Advanced Civ, and yet it feels closer to Civ than it does to Advanced Civ in a number of key areas, or at least in terms of my key preferences. In fact, the last big game that I played before COVID in March of 2020 was a game of Mega Civ for my birthday. And I will happily play Mega Civ. It's largely a player count issue, and if I've got 7 or fewer people, I will play Civ. If I've got more than that, I'll play Mega Civ or Western or Eastern Empires, depending on which version you'd rather. The differences are purely geographical and which civilizations are in play. Again, I think it's important that people give credit where credit is due, and in the design notes to Mega Civ, they keep talking about how they're so impressed with Tresham's brilliance, which is strange, and they just cut out the designers and developers of Advanced Civ from the narrative entirely, which I don't think is very cool. Again, possibly a rights issue, but a simple hat tip in a rulebook doesn't cost you anything. And despite that, I think they've managed to preserve enough of what made Civ preferable to Advanced Civilization that I'm happy to play it.
Okay, so moving on to the games that we're looking forward to, Neelan, I assume...
Didn't we cut off Kellen? Kellen, didn't you have something to say?
Oh, did you have something?
No, that was actually my question, if there was any modern implementation, because it's like, we played Clash of Cultures, and it's just like, why are we playing this? It's so long. And I was just curious if there was anything that was newer or prettier. And not to say that I would play this, and I think we may have a misunderstanding. Like, the premise of this episode, if someone got into the hobby right now, right, I would say 9 out of 10 games that they should buy should be more than 5 years old. Like, I think we're all aligned on what's good, and it's not really chasing the hotness. So I have nothing but respect for older stuff. It's just, like, if I got the group together to play Civ, I feel like I would hear a little bit of weeping and wailing around the design. Like I recently took a group through diplomacy, but I found a variant board that was more beautiful, and I printed it out on nice paper to try to plus up what we were doing. Do you find, is there anything that even approaches it, or would you say just do the original, just go for it?
Okay, so the Gibson's version, the one that's in print, you can actually get it from major American retailers, is kind of garish. And although it looks slightly more modern than the original Avalon Hill version, and to say nothing of the original Heartland Trefoil version of 1980, the Avalon Hill version came out in 81, it's still not going to compete visually with something like Clash of Cultures, for example. But in terms of visually appealing civilization games, I would say look no further than Tigris and Euphrates, and not Civilization in the same way, but again, in the sense of when I want to play a Civilization game, I want to see sweep, I want to see ebb and flow, I want to see a sense of progress, I want to see the sense of narrative, rather than, again, these ridiculous, out-of-context Immortal God Kings going and stomping around the map. So I would point to things like Tigris and Euphrates. I'd even sometimes point to things like Innovation, quite frankly, in terms of capturing those elements. But in terms of getting something that's visually appealing, a user by the name of Evan Derrick a few years ago did a total graphic overhaul of both Civilization and Advanced Civilization. The files are still available on Board Game Geek if you go searching for them. And obviously art is subjective in a matter of taste, but it is more of a sort of modern, contemporary aesthetic in terms of board games, and particularly in terms of how it represents antiquity. So, of course, everything's very sepia, aged scroll looks, and so forth, modern graphic effects and flourishes of that nature. So that is also something you can take a look at.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's probably on Nealon to get this print and play done or get the game out for us, because I do think we would enjoy it.
Totally.
It would just be the case of how you get it set up and getting the right amount of players.
I'll be in LA in 2 weeks, so let's do it.
Start printing now, Nealon. It's going to take you that long, I would assume.
All right, so on to the games that we want to play that have been released in that time period. I think we have already talked about Nealon's choice.
Yes,
is that correct,
absolutely.
Nealon? All right, so Kellen, what game from that era have you always wanted to try?
Yes, so I have 3, and they're a little bit of a cheat. The first is Vadis, who I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation of, 1991 Reiner Knizia negotiation game. I have this. I've played it once, and it was like, I think we only had 3 or 4 players, and I believe it's like best at 5. I just keep hearing diplomacy in 20 to 45 minutes with a clean, elegant rule set. I just feel like I have it in my closet, and for whatever reason, I have not played it enough because I feel like I'm going to love it. So that's the first one that I just need to say. And I know I literally went back and looked in the archives. I mentioned this in episode 10 of the podcast, so many, many years ago. The second is Bausack, but that's just because I wanted to say the word Bausack. And the third is a game from 1986. I believe it's 1986. I don't remember. This is, for whatever reason, just sticks in my brain. I have not played it. This is Ikusa, Shogun, or Samurai Swords. I don't know why. I think that when I got on Board Game Geek and started participating in the hobby, this game was just popping. It wasn't still popular. It just kept showing up in the type of games that I liked. It is a Risk-esque thing set in Japan. It is still in the top 1,000 on Board Game Geek, which I find pretty fascinating for a game I have not heard anyone mention in the past 5 to 10 years. I just went on and did some more research. Honestly, I did more research about this game today than at any point in my entire career in the hobby, but it's just always there in the back of my mind. I should buy Ikusa and try this. I don't know why. And Mark Bigney, you've played this, it looks like.
Nope,
You have not. But you are aware of it.
I'm familiar with the degree of enthusiasm for all the games in that so-called Game Master series from Milton Bradley that you're talking about. Yeah, it does come up and mentioned pretty frequently.
This is a Milton Bradley, like, huge box, a lot of plastic game, right? Am I getting that right?
Like Axis and Allies, but
sure, yeah.
But in Japan, it's like people are citing like luck reduction and compared to Risk, a really random starting setup that makes everything feel fresh every game. I don't know why. It's just one of those names that sticks with me as I will play this game. And in fact, I'm already hunting for a copy in the sidebar as we speak because it's one of those things where it's just been tickling my brain for over 10 years now.
As for myself, I have a cheat answer, but I have a real answer as well. My cheat answer is it was Bausack. I also wanted to just say Bausack, but now you've afforded me the luxury of saying it, so I appreciate that, Kellen. No, so my cheat answer is Antike 2 because it was not released prior to 2005, but I know Antike was produced before that. The way this game, frankly, got on my radar is hearing about Mark talk about it. So he's the one who got me interested in it. I have enjoyed most, if not all, Matt Gert's games that I've ever played, and I've heard nothing but praise about Antike 2. So I would have put that on if it met the threshold. But I understand, I think that Antike 2 is superior to the original Antike, so it didn't seem like it would fit my list. So the game that I did choose, my choice here is, and Mark, I know you are the accent guy on your show. Kellen is the accent guy on our show, so he's assured me that the way to pronounce this is Die Macher.
There it is.
So I think other people have called it incorrectly Die Macher.
Philistines, fools.
This is the game about German politics that I've heard nothing but great stuff about. It's a game that I've owned. I've never played, primarily because I feel like it's going to be a tough sell. You know, hey guys, you want to play a game about German politics that takes 4 hours or whatever? And also because of the length. But just feels right up my alley. Again, I like any game that has... This is not necessarily... Well, I guess it's historical. I'm sure the German government has changed in some ways, and I don't know how much of a simulation or representation of the German government it is, but just an interesting theme, in my opinion, something that appeals to me that I've always wanted to play, but never had a chance to. So that is Die Macher.
I assume you're referring to the Hans im Glück / Valley Games editions, as opposed to the new one by Spielworks.
Yes, I have the Valley Games edition, and I was excited when the new one was announced by Spielworks, but then I heard mixed things about it, so I decided just to hold on to my Valley Games version. Is that what you would recommend as the version to play?
They're very different. I'm not sure... I haven't played the new one enough to comment, but it is definitely an effort to address some of the issues of esoteric elements of coalition forming and of length. Those were the two, well, that and the weird way the public opinion polls work. And to some extent, I think they were successful, to others since less so. And the Valley Games edition had its own issues, but they're both fascinating designs, and I recommend trying them both.
Okay, perfect. And what about you, Mark?
So, I'm very thankful to have the opportunity to talk about some of my favorite 20th century games designers. And another one of them is a man by the name of Richard Hamblin, who's done some truly amazing work. Probably less influential than Tresham, though, because I can't really think of many people who are as influential as Tresham. And Richard Hamblin put out his games for Avalon Hill in the late 70s and 80s. He's probably best known for his 1979 game Magic Realm, which I love despite the fact that it is both absurd and bizarre, I suppose is the best way to put it. Also, his 1982 game Gunslinger, which is also absurd and bizarre, because you may think that turns should represent a certain amount of time. A turn in Gunslinger represents 2 seconds, and each turn is subdivided into 5 phases. So, it has a bizarre approach to time, but really did some interesting things with action programming. And then his 1988 game Merchant of Venus, which is probably his most accessible game. I do not recommend the Fantasy Flight version. I recommend the Avalon Hill version. At any rate, the one game of his that I have not played is Victory in the Pacific, which was published in 1977. This is partially because I don't find the Pacific theater that interesting. You people, being various shades of American, will know, of course, that the salient things that happened in World War II were Battle of the Bulge, Normandy, the Pacific Theater, and Gettysburg, probably in ascending order of importance. Nothing else really happened in World War II. But other than the recent excellent Conquest and Consequence, I've never really enjoyed Pacific Theater games. It's just a personal preference thing. But there's a great deal of debate about the extent to which it has aged well or poorly in terms of relatively rules-light historical war games. It's not one of your shorter experiences. Consensus is that it runs somewhere between 4 to 6 hours if you're going to do the entire Pacific Theater. But in the context of historical war games, to do the entire Pacific Theater, that's not very long. And I had a copy once, but I didn't have anyone to play it with, so I eventually traded it along. Let us call this the Mark Basada Shuffle. And ultimately, I have regretted doing so because I would really like to round out my experience of Richard Hamblin, because he was a bit of a mad genius, which I say in the most flattering possible terms. And if I'm going to try more games in the Pacific Theater, I might as well do it through the lens of Richard Hamblin. So I've went through a big kick about 10 years ago, tracking down as many Avalon Hill games as I could. And at one point I had quite an extensive collection of the Bookshelf series and a whole bunch of other ones. And most of them have since left my collection. But there were some real gems of that period, late 70s, early 80s. And Victory in the Pacific is one that I never managed to play, and I would really like to.
Do you have the need or want to own all of the games that Richard Hamblin has made, or just a desire to have experienced all of them?
My attitude towards collecting has shifted considerably over the course of the past few years, and part of that has shifted in response to being a reviewer. The churn of games has increased because of a certain professional obligation to try things that I wouldn't necessarily otherwise want to try. And if I'm the one who is the primary one in my group who acquires games, which I am, then I'm going to have to get it. And what this means is that I've had to become much less precious about holding things around. This applies both to new things that I'm getting as well as older things that I'm holding on to. So where I am now, there are absolutely some games that I will hold on to even with no realistic expectation of playing them again. Gunslinger and Magic Realm are two excellent examples of that. I'm going to hold on to them because I think they were fascinating little time capsules of development history and of bizarre ideas that have not really been replicated elsewhere in other games. But as far as being a Richard Hamblin completionist, that's probably gone by the wayside. So I don't regret not having it in my collection. I would like to try it. And even if I very much enjoyed it, I probably wouldn't feel the need to own it, if that answers your question.
It does. It's basically like a horror story about what being a board game reviewer / influencer has done to you.
We suffer for you, listeners. We suffer for you.
I keep trying to get you. I keep trying to bait you into the influencer word. I unfortunately baited you when we weren't recording.
It's a slur that I refuse to dignify.
Fair enough.
Next, you're going to call me a content creator.
Even Kellen won't use language like that, and he has very low standards. So,
I had a quick question just to round up.
Oh, sure.
And this is very directed at you, Mr. Mark Posada. Have you played Subbuteo?
I have not.
So I was racking my...
Oh, this is a soccer game. This is a soccer game. Yes. No, I have not.
I was racking my brain for games I had when I was younger that actually still probably held up. You know, I had a lot of dumb classics, but nothing that I would still play today. But Subbuteo stuck in my mind is like, man, I should try get that and play that with you because it's a fantastic, just, you know, basic dexterity flicking soccer game, and I think you would probably love it.
Is this the one where you flick a disc with another disc?
Well, they're little weebly wobbly players that you flick around like a pitch, and you're flicking them into the ball basically, and that's it. That's the game.
I believe, Mark, though, it is called football.
I go to you for all accent questions now that Kellen has let me down with.
What word are you
Macher.
saying?
I'm also the resident sports ball expert.
Oh, of course. You and I have plenty of side conversations. Now that I'm in Vegas, whenever I'm making a sports wager, I always go to Bigney. That's my thing now.
I always want to cover the spread, whatever that means. Yeah, my enthusiasm for dexterity games is such that it would even overwhelm my disdain for sports ball. I would love to try Subbuteo myself.
My understanding is that it was never much of a thing in the Americas. It was predominantly only in the UK and Europe, I assume.
But it's still a thing, isn't it? You
can
buy
it still gets
teams,
it. It gets remade over and over again, re-released. You can still go into a store in South Africa, at least is my frame of reference, and buy a copy of Subbuteo. So,
okay, can we say that word slower so that I understand? I thought you were saying saboteur, and I'm like, this game is from 2004. Guys.
So it is
Subbuteo. It was designed by Phil Collins.
What is the word you're saying?
Subbuteo.
Okay.
I don't know what that means or why it is a soccer flicking game, but
Nealon, it is called football.
It will surprise nobody that I have gone on a number of deep dives for soccer-themed board games, and Subbuteo was definitely one that I found, but I have not yet got a copy of. But yeah, would love to. Would love to. I would absolutely love to play it, for sure.
It seems delightful. It's this marvelous little intersection of mass-market, mainstream sports appeal, and incredibly nerdy toy factor that just appeals to me on some fundamental level.
Yeah, definitely. So that will do it for our show. Again, a huge thank you to Mark Bigney of So Very Wrong About Games. I assume everyone who is listening to this show has listened to their excellent podcast. If not, I would implore you to do so. Again, that is So Very Wrong About Games with Mark Bigney and Michael Walker. They put on a great show.
Thank you very much.
You're very, very welcome. And I know we've joked about it a bunch, but we would absolutely love it if you went to boardgamebarrage.com/vote and voted for us for best podcast. And honestly, we would encourage you to vote for all your favorite podcasts and all your favorite games. It's been an honor to mention. I know that's a cliche, but really, when we first were listed as a nominee a couple of years ago, it was a thrill, and it still is a thrill. When we made the cut of the top 10 last week, it was a super thrill for me as a person who would go on Board Game Geek throughout my life. To be listed as the person who could win a Golden Geek, as silly as it is, as much of a silly popularity contest as it is, it still was super fun, super cool.
Legitimately, congratulations, you guys.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And it would be, to use another sports analogy, it would be wonderful to receive the baton that's been passed from So Very Wrong to ourselves. Again, I just use a sports analogy because I know how much Mark loves them. But if you want to
Is running a sport?
Passing the baton, Kellen, passing the baton.
Okay.
It's the baton toss. It's a classic sport.
That's
You
right.
have the baton, you throw it at a podcaster's head. I don't know why it's a podcaster, but apparently it is.
Exactly. That's right. That's exactly how sports work. I'll link you to the ESPN Ocho World Championship there. Anyhow, thank you so much for listening. You can find us on all forms of social media. You can find our wiki at boardgamebarrage.com/wiki. You can find our Discord, which is full of very welcoming, very awesome people at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. A huge thank you, as always, to Heart Society for our intro and outro song, What's on Your Mind, Kid, from the album Wake the Queens. And as always, thank you guys so much. We will talk to you next week. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Did you choose Yellow Tank for branding purposes for your podcast, So Very Wrong About Games?
No, it's because I play yellow.
Okay.
Oh, cool.
That is the good answer, because I thought you got me there, and I was like, how could he beat me at any branding conversation?
Where is my favorite tank?
She is
Where's
on the.
everyone's
She did want to say hi. I can see if she's here. She can. But here's the thing, okay? If I give up the mic, then everyone will be like, "Oh, she should stay."
Kellen,
she's
we
better.
need to win this thing. We need to win this thing. We
But-
need to pull out all
I'm
the
just saying
stops.
that I fear that I won't be coming back. It's the-
Kellen,
Sacrifice
Give
for
the
the
people
team.
what they want, Kellen.
Exactly.
If you're going to pander, go all the way.
That's right.
Hello.
Hello. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's very nice to see you. How have things been?
Good. Super busy, but just life returning to normal, I guess. Makes things
Or something
very
resembling
busy.
it, sure.
Is this being recorded? Is this what's happening?
Absolutely.
Well,
And we only want to hear one thing from you, Christine, and that is boardgamebarrage.com/vote.
Yes.
Yeah, they said
There you
something
go.
about
That's it.
how you were going to get that tattooed on your forehead live on air.
Right.
That's happening. Definitely.
I said that sounded excessive, but they were very insistent.
It would be weird if they stopped. They've already done the BOA. You have to keep going.
I was outside when I walked in and heard that I was coming to say hello, which I'm very happy to say hello, but I also have no idea what's happening in the episode. Has the actual episode started recording, or are you guys just chit-chatting?
No, we're always live. This is always ready to air. So
Okay.
yeah, no, we're in the middle of it.
Okay, so what are we talking about? I'm ready. Let's do it.
We're talking about winning the Golden Geek Award for Best Podcast.
Oh, okay. Okay, yes. Vote for us, please.
That's all we needed. That'll sway the listeners for sure.
Okay, good. All right, next topic. What are we doing?
All right. So what have you been playing this week, Christina?
Oh, that's where we're at in the episode?
Yeah, we're really early on.
Okay. I'm going to be completely honest with you guys, and you should not put this in the episode. I have not played anything this week.
I was told I would be joining professionals.
Well, then I definitely won't let Kellen come back.
That's true. That's a good point.
All right. Well, it's good to see you. It's actually good to see all of you because, Neelan, it's been forever since I've seen you, too.
It has been long. Yeah, we're going to have to make a point to do something in the next week.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, thanks for coming on the podcast, Mark.
Thank you for jumping in. It was nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. All right. I will talk to you guys later.
Bye, Christina.
Bye.
Oh, well, this is interesting. Let me go look here. I'm gonna give you guys my unbiased opinion here. Best podcast. Board Game Barrage.
This is clearly an explicit endorsement for
Board Game Barrage.
Here, I'll say it. I endorse this podcast you are listening to currently for the Golden Geek Award.
Wow, that's so nice of you to say. Thank you, Tom, Dan, and Mike. Disclaimer, the views of Tom Vassell, Mike DeLisio, and Dan Hughes just expressed might not actually be the views of Tom Vassell, Mike DeLisio, or Dan Hughes. They may be just cut up audio that I used from the Sporadically Bored podcast to get a cheap endorsement from all three of them, but maybe they are really endorsements. Who knows? I'll never tell.